I think it's great that we're doing this together. You lead the China Strategy Initiative, one of the Council on Foreign Relations' 4 main strategic initiatives. I lead the Climate Realism Initiative. And we're talking about this crossover topic today, American competitiveness in emerging technology industries. And I gotta say, Rush, for much of my experience in this space, in climate and clean technology, this has not been the case, that one of the central topics of your initiative, China Strategy, and one of the central topics of mine, climate realism, would actually be the same topic. Only recently has it been the case that there's so much press that China has this new 3 export industries: batteries, electric vehicles, solar panels. These are all technologies that are critical for the clean energy transition, but they're also right in the middle of the strategic battleground between the United States and China. And frankly, there's not much of a battleground given how lopsided the race has been so far. So I guess I'd throw it over to you. Why is this important from your perspective in the China Strategy Initiative?
Sure. Well, I think what it gets down to is that these technologies are critical to the future. They're critical to the future of American industry. They're also critical to the future of American manufacturing. If the U.S. is going to make, for example, next generation humanoid robotics, they're going to need batteries. And those batteries are going to need to be manufactured somewhere where the U.S. has some ability to assure reliable supply. And to make sure that you can manufacture those batteries, you need scale. And what better way to get scale than the auto sector? And so once again, EVs, batteries, they all tie to questions of defense industry, employment, jobs, and quite frankly, the future of American manufacturing. And the fact that so much is concentrated in China has enormous implications for U.S. competitiveness in the period ahead.
And it's insane how concentrated it is, right? As far as I can tell, China has chokeholds on a series of strategic sectors. They produce 2/3 of global wind turbines. They produce over 80% of global solar panels, 99% of graphite, a critical component of batteries, of which China produces 80% globally, all China controlled. Electric vehicles, an increasing area of Chinese control, where I think over 70% of electric vehicles are Chinese produced. How did we get to this position, and why is this a bad thing?
It's interesting. This is a subset of a much bigger global trend. The share of manufacturing that China has controlled used to be only about 6% 25 years ago. Today, it's 30%. Now, 25 years ago, the U.S. was somewhere between 25 and 30. Today, we're at maybe 15 to 17. And in 5 years, China will be up to 40%. We might be down to 11%, according to UN statistics. What this shows is manufacturing as a whole has basically moved to China. And naturally, that means the manufacturing of renewable energy technology, batteries, solar panels, turbines, all of that is also moving to China. But we can't forget that a critical reason this is happening is also concerted efforts in industrial policy planning, industrial targeting, subsidies, and basic science research in China that is propelling them to greater heights of competitiveness.
I think it's a great point. I mean, even though China calls it the new 3 export industries, I think you're the one who wrote in a recent report that China's been doing this for decades. They've made these strategic bets in these sectors, and the fruits of their labor are now paying off decades after those far-sighted strategic bets. They're kind of the old 3 export industries that they planned 2 decades ago. This also surfaces an interesting point for me, which is, isn't it coincidental that all of these climate and clean technologies ended up being right at the center of this broader constellation of industrial technologies that you're mentioning? And it's not so much of a coincidence when I realized that, in fact, solar energy is fundamentally maybe the most obvious energy source for humanity. We get more energy from the sun every hour than the whole world requires every year. Electric vehicles are inherently more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. Batteries are the cornerstone of our modern economy, not just for clean technologies like electric vehicles, but batteries also can power drones and missiles and warfighter equipment, etc. It seems to me like all of these technologies that are at the core of the clean energy transition also just are fundamentally superior technologies in the long run, and we should be investing in them. I will say, though, when I think about climate and clean technologies, there's a distinction in my mind between what I call technologies of abundance, solar, batteries, and technologies I consider of what I call scarcity. Technologies that if climate weren't a problem, we'd never really ever want to invest in these technologies because they don't have any other intrinsic economic value, like carbon capture, carbon dioxide removal. Those don't matter, and they're economically drags if climate really isn't a problem. And so I think you and I, for this conversation, have been focused mostly on these technologies of abundance that have a dual purpose, both to reduce emissions and to provide a cornerstone for the modern economy.
That's true. And those technologies of abundance, as you call them, they are supply side technologies, right? It makes sense that a technology that allows you to harvest a nearly limitless energy of the sun and then store it for as much time as you possibly can will be valuable for manufacturing or for any number of purposes, right? These are technologies that push forward the future of what industrial equipment can do. And so naturally, whoever leads in that space isn't just leading in the fight against emissions, they're leading at pushing forward the frontier of what humanity can do with energy. They're energy technologies, not just clean energy technologies. A battery doesn't care whether the energy came from a nuclear reactor or a solar panel or a coal-fired plant. The battery stores the energy. And so I think you're right. The reason that we're focusing on this is precisely because this is the future. And if the US is not investing in that future, then it's going to miss out. And imagine, for example, a country that missed out on the steam engine or missed out on electrification or missed out on mass manufacturing. That's what's at stake right now if we miss out on essentially these new energy technologies.
I want to pick out a couple of these that you've mentioned, Rush. You just mentioned nuclear. You mentioned batteries earlier on. You want to say a word about nuclear? Is China eating our lunch on nuclear?
Yeah. I mean, nuclear is shocking, right? America has been the leader in nuclear technology since, well, forever, right? Since the modern age. But now that's not really the case. We did invent essentially the technology for the fourth generation nuclear reactor, the safest reactor that's ever been designed. But we didn't scale up its production. We don't really know how to build it yet. Meanwhile, China took the technology, which we had in fact freely transferred, and is now investing in building that technology at scale. Right now, China is planning to build 100 nuclear reactors in the next 20 years. They're spending $20 billion at least annually on nuclear production. Right now, China's power generation is 2 times the US power generation in total. But if these reactors come online and we stand still, it could go to 4 times or 5 times. And at that point, here's what is really crazy. It means China's per person energy production is greater than ours. And with a 1.4 billion person population, that is a shocking statistic. Cheap energy also has enormous implications for industry, for AI, for a variety of other industrial sectors. And quite frankly, no power has succeeded in being an industrial power without cheap energy. In fact, even Great Britain, when it was rising the ranks of industrial powers, was itself blessed with cheap energy. That's the risk that we face if we don't invest.
I think it's a super important point, and coming from the community I come from, which is the climate, often environmentalist, and clean energy community, there's a little bit of a discordant note that strikes. There's a chart circulating on X, erstwhile Twitter right now, that says, look at China's energy use, and look at the United States' energy use, which is kind of stagnant in comparison, and look at China's rate of electrification of the economy, right? They're switching from combusting these liquid fuels to electrifying much of their economy in industry, for example, or residential. And the United States really is stagnating in terms of electrification. I think the point you're making is different from the point many of us climate folks have made historically. We have said it's a feature, not a bug, that America is using less energy because look at us, we're just more productive with our existing energy. And so therefore, we are decoupling GDP from energy and we will become more and more energy efficient and we actually don't need that much energy. Nowadays, with the revival of manufacturing, with the advent of AI data centers, which are truly energy hungry, I wonder if that conventional wisdom is wrong, that in fact, the country that has the most cheap and abundant energy is actually the country that's going to do quite well, and that metrics of energy increase actually are metrics of competitiveness. And here in the United States, you just made the point about nuclear, right? We are missing out on this tremendous energy source, which is nuclear. We don't build nuclear reactors nearly as fast as China does. China exports them and gets geopolitical leverage. We don't. When it comes to solar, China has solar panels that are what I once thought would be unfathomably cheap, less than 8 cents a watt. We pay 26 cents a watt because we apply huge tariffs and trade barriers on Chinese solar panels. So we have 3 times the cost of the Chinese cost of solar energy, which is the cheapest, most dominant force of energy around the world. So I just think that we in the climate community, we may want to reconceptualize how we think about energy. It's probably a good thing to have more energy. And that's, if I hear you correctly, Rush, that's the fuel for the economy.
Well, I actually agree. And I think that probably there's something in the national security space we also need to reconceptualize. The fact that solar is so cheap might be the most significant energy finding of all time. I mean, you've written a book on this. I think the fact that we could import those panels without tariffs potentially, and use them to reduce the cost of producing other manufactured goods, in net actually makes the American economy more competitive. Does it make sense to have high tariffs on solar panels if that means higher costs of production of other higher value goods than those solar panels? I'm not sure that it does. So you're right. I think the climate community maybe can get behind the idea that energy abundance is good for the climate and also good for the economy. And the national security community can get behind the idea that maybe importing some of the cheapest ways to produce that energy is good for economic gains and for strategic efficiency.
This makes me think of kind of a three-part framework that we might adopt for which technologies we here in America really want to index on producing and maybe even apply some tariff barriers or trade restrictions to prevent Chinese products from undercutting us. I think you and I might agree, and correct me if I'm wrong, you and I might agree that solar would not be one of those technologies, that we're perfectly fine importing solar panels. So my three parts are, number one, a technology should be something that we can be inherently better at. We have some comparative advantage at compared with China. Number two, there's some strategic advantage that this technology, us producing this technology, gives us. And number three, this technology should be somewhat or very profitable. And I think solar fails on these tests. It's not very profitable at all. It's actually miserably unprofitable. There is not much of a strategic advantage to making our own solar panels rather than importing them because, if China cuts off the supply of solar panels, absolutely nothing happens to the United States. And we have no real comparative advantage anymore. This has become a real commodity product. Now, next generation solar technologies, we might have a comparative advantage. But here's another example of a technology that you brought up, Rush, which is next generation batteries. I think that batteries pass those three tests with flying colors.
I agree.
I mean, there's a clear strategic advantage, not just electric vehicles, but you mentioned drones and military equipment. We need to be able to make batteries. There's a comparative advantage. America has invented next generation solid state batteries. Like, we have a real chance in the next 18 months to commercialize and use them. And they can be highly profitable. Today's lithium ion batteries are highly unprofitable. There's huge overcapacity in China. But next generation batteries, imagine if you had a drone that could go twice as far or have twice the power density, that would be a tremendously profitable export for the United States. So I'd love to see us prioritize our technologies a little bit differently.
I kind of agree that batteries are critical. I mean, electrification is sort of a world historic trend. We sort of went through an initial wave of electrification back in the era of Edison, but there's sort of a second wave happening now with these batteries that have enormous capacity and they're increasingly smaller in size, right? So these batteries are pushing forward the frontier again of what technology can do, whether that's drones or whether that's humanoid robotics or whether that's making the grid more resilient. The problem is we don't produce them. Yeah. And I think there's a tendency to see batteries as a kind of climate issue, right? As a kind of green issue. But the truth is batteries, like the steam engine, are actually a hard industrial issue. We need to reconceptualize how we see batteries, not just as part of this broader effort to bring down global emissions, but also as part of an effort to win the future of technology, manufacturing. Even the arms industry is going to need next generation batteries. The one thing I would push back a little bit on is the question of profitability. I think one of the challenges that the U.S. has faced in maintaining its industrial base is we focus so much on quarterly profits and dividends as the markets have taken over everything, certainly corporate decision-making, that we're not able to do long-term investment. What China is doing many times is running losses in the short term because they want market share, and in the long term they think they can make it all back up on the back end when they're the last player standing. We have to be able to find financial instruments that allow us to invest in the future, even if it's not profitable today or tomorrow or the day after. Down the road, we need the capacity. We have to be willing to spend to get it.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. There might be a germ of a disagreement that we have. We've been aligned on everything so far. Definitely want to come back to this because I personally am very, very afraid of endless subsidies. But I do want to ask you, we agree on so much here. We want America to be competitive globally in batteries, in nuclear. I can think of some other technologies of abundance like next generation geothermal, digital technologies for the grid. What do we do about it? Given that what you said, China's had this long, far-sighted strategic vision. They have a new 3 export industries. They're throwing their state capacity behind it. And you started to allude to some of these instruments that you mentioned. Right. What do we do about all this?
Well, let's take a step back. What we know is that China has twice our population. It has twice our manufacturing capacity today, on track to 3 to 4 times. It has twice our power generation. All of that has significant impacts for whether or not we can manufacture effectively and efficiently against them. But we have something else, right? We have something they don't have, which is a network of alliances and partners that are also incredibly capable manufacturers and that fundamentally would prefer to be in business with us, strategically, economically, politically, geopolitically, compared to China. So, Kurt Campbell and I, former Deputy Secretary of State, wrote an article about allied scale. And the idea is if you're up against China, which has enormous scale, then the best way to compete is to build scale of your own. We can't do it just as one country isolated. But if you combine the US and Europe and Japan and Korea and Taiwan and India and maybe Canada and Mexico, what you get is more manufacturing capability than China, more power generation, more patents, more scientists, more everything, more market share. And that is our path to scale. When you said we don't want to have endless subsidies, I agree. And the path to avoiding endless subsidies, the path to avoiding a Soviet-style economy, which is not going to be justified by market logic, the path to avoiding that is to pooling market share with our allies and maybe creating some kind of wall or moat against China's excess capacity. Not on every issue, maybe not on solar panels, but certainly on the ones that matter that we've talked about, like batteries or potentially nuclear. You add that to industrial policy programs that can create investment in industries that the capital markets won't fund. And you add to that the possibility of offtake, right? Guaranteed purchases by allies, by partners, by industry, by the military. And suddenly you've got a recipe for industrial success. It's not easy. It's not something that the United States is good at, but it's something that is essential. And we can't do it alone. If we work with others, we can get there in the next few years, but we have to move now.
I guess I'd love to hear your take, because you've thought about this so much, Rush. You have a great foreign affairs article with Kurt Campbell on exactly this topic. And I remember reading that article and thinking to myself, I love it, I love it, I love it. For example, you and Kurt write that South Korea could be an important supplier in the supply chain for these products that we co-create. But then I thought, alarm bell, the political economy of this is kind of worrying, right? Because you have a brand of the industrial policy set of supporters, largely from this Trumpian MAGA crowd, who'd prefer for just everything to happen autarkically in the United States. How do we solve this political economy problem? So, for example, we keep bringing up batteries. I have this dream about a battery supply chain that looks like this. We cut out Chinese graphite because we don't need graphite anymore, because solid-state batteries don't use graphite. But the entire supply chain now is across American allies and partners. It's Japan that's producing the separators, for example, or some of the cathode active materials. It's the United States that brings the IP with our next generation companies that have world-beating technology. But how do we solve the political economy constraints to enable free trade across our allies and partners for a truly robust supply chain that can compete with China? And how do we then also have market share across our allies and partners in Europe and Asia, with India, for example, instead of just autarkically putting up barriers everywhere and trying to do everything ourselves?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, what we're talking about is sort of allied trade or free trade within a kind of allied sphere, which looks like what free trade was, during a lot of the Cold War. When we had GATT, for example, the Soviet Union was not a part of that. So back then, we sort of had this, and we still had disagreements among industrial economies on the allocation of imbalances and who got to produce what, who would consume what. Those were real challenges. One way around some of them is to recognize that we're not going to solve everything. But in certain essential technologies, like the ones we've talked about, batteries or nuclear, we need to make sure there's sufficient scale and capacity within this sphere, if you will. How do you make that happen politically? Well, you could imagine, for example, as we saw in the last administration that you and I both served in, a Korean investment in battery facilities in the United States. You could imagine the U.S. providing Korea investment in other technology or military equipment that they need to keep themselves safe. What we have to do is look across just the economic and tech space and understand that this allied sphere includes a lot of other issues, including security ones. And we have to look at clever ways of attracting investment. I mean, ultimately, we are not going to be able to produce, for example, as you mentioned, a lithium-ion battery completely on our own at scale. But the Koreans are pretty good at some of that. So maybe if they set up plants here, we can get better. And maybe if we innovate solid-state batteries and we're ahead of them, we can set up a plant in Korea, right? There are all kinds of ways we can benefit. One of the key things to do, though, I think, is to find ways to ensure that industrial policy programs in all of these countries have some degree of opportunity for other countries to partake in them if they're investing. Yeah. And remember, IRA was going to award all kinds of benefits to companies from abroad that invested in America. We probably want American companies to enjoy the same advantages in a place like Korea or Japan or India. And I think we can get there.
Rush, you just mentioned the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022. It was called at the time the landmark climate legislation of our generation, the biggest U.S. climate bill ever. And it had over $1 trillion of support for various technologies that we've been talking about. We're taping this in the middle of the reconciliation process, so hard to know where this lands, but it looks like a large part of it is going to be rolled back or repealed or curtailed. And I look at this not just as a calamity, but really an opportunity. Because if you ask me, a lot of the IRA was not laser focused on the goals that we've been talking about, on American competitiveness. I think we may disagree a little bit on what the true goal should be. For me, it is creating globally competitive industries in these emerging technologies. I want to replace the top 5 exports we have today, oil, gas, petroleum-fueled planes, petroleum-fueled vehicles, and gas products, with clean emerging technologies that we export around the world. But to do that, they have to be highly profitable, and they have to be in areas where we can win. It may be the case that if I'm hearing you right, you may want us to make some stuff that we can't obviously win in, but we should create these robust industrial supply chains with our allies and partners, and I can get on board with that. Going forward, if we have a second shot, let's hope, at something that comes after the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, after this partial or full repeal, what should we do differently this time around?
Yeah, it's an important question. IRA was sort of one tool that we had legislatively to get after this problem, but it's not the only tool available to the U.S. government. Take the Defense Production Act, right? I had a chance to testify just a few weeks ago before the Senate Banking Committee on the Defense Production Act and why it matters for competition with China in the industrial space. And quite frankly, the industrial opportunity that the Defense Production Act provides is a platform to invest in technology at scale and create capacity that the market might not otherwise create on its own. We can do a number of investments with, DPA, Defense Production Act, Title III, in batteries or other technologies to make ourselves more competitive in those spaces. You're right, we may not produce the capability to export around the world relative to China, but we will produce the capability to at least service our own needs, maybe the needs of some allies, and that can create scale that over time creates more efficiency and know-how. There's 2 points I got to make. One is, if you don't make something, you're never going to learn how to make it better. So once you lose manufacturing, you don't just lose that product, you lose all the future products that come from it. So we have to get back in the game. And second, the reality is that the United States, as a manufacturing country, has some disadvantages relative to China. We innovate in all these areas. We innovated in solar panels, we innovated in EVs, we even innovated in batteries. But China outscaled us. They produced, whereas we innovated. Whatever we do in the future, we may innovate again. But if they outscale us, we're not going to be competitive. So we have to find a way to get scale back. And that is going to require some loss-leading investment in some of these industries. It is going to require some agreements with allies and partners. And you know what, Vern? It's probably going to require some tariffs in a few sectors to make sure we have a moat to be competitive ourselves.
Look, I think it's a great point. And I want, through our Climate Realism Initiative, for us to reconceptualize climate and clean energy much more through the lens of the national security and economic imperatives that you've been discussing. Some aspect of that is in line with what you've been saying. For example, in World War II, General Motors' production capacity was repurposed for military tank production. Similarly, there are lots of good national security reasons to have manufacturing, and I think I'm on board with many of these. I think what I'd like to see, there are a lot of unsexy things that we don't talk about that much. Under the Trump first administration, under the Obama administration, under the Biden administration, we've always had increasing funding for clean energy research, development, and demonstration, for these technology commercialization programs. They're not that expensive, right? The Inflation Reduction Act was over $1 trillion in potential expense before its potential repeal. But these programs were $10 to $25 billion a year, right? It's not a large expense.
No.
I think we can continue to invest domestically in our innovation ecosystem to make our technologies better. And I think that there is a potential for us to rebalance. I was not a fan of the fact that under President Biden, we spent over 90% of our battery investments on deploying today's technology and far less than 10% on developing tomorrow's technology. I'd like to see that kind of even out to 50-50 so that we can accomplish what you're saying, which is you just got to start building. It will build the muscle. And let's build the stuff we can actually win in. We're going to lose in lithium ion to China, but maybe we can win in next generation solid state.
Yeah, I agree. I think funding the technologies of the future has always been an imperative for the United States, certainly since the Second World War. Right? That ecosystem, Vannevar Bush, Endless Frontiers, focusing on science and technology, created the American position we now all enjoy. But that position is fragile. And if we don't renew it every generation, then we miss the next generation of technology, because technology doesn't stand still, and neither can the United States. I do worry that the cuts to the National Science Foundation and to basic science research are going to imperil our ability to win those next technologies. But I also agree with you that it'd be nice to see our industrial policy efforts balanced in a way that achieves scale in the technologies we need today, but puts down payments on the technologies we're going to have tomorrow. And without some kind of balance there, other countries will bet on the future and get there first.
Rush, this has been awesome. I'm so encouraged that there's so many things that we can agree on, but coming from such different perspectives. You're trying to advance American national interests in the face of this great power competition with China. And for me, one of the motivating aspects of my career is trying to solve this climate crisis. But there's one wedge issue that I wonder whether that will really divide our two initiatives or whether we'll be aligned. And that's on the role of China in the global clean energy transition. Look, there is no denying that China not only is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, which is a really bad thing, but it's also the world's biggest investor in the technologies of tomorrow. We've talked about the new three export industries, which self-interestedly are very good for China for itself to win in. But they are, in fact, kind of doing the world a favor by exporting cheap solar panels to Pakistan, for example, or to India. And so I'm curious how you think about whether China is, in fact, doing the world a service by producing all of these cheap, zero-emission technologies, exporting nuclear around the world, or if, on balance, American interests are just degraded if China does very well in these new clean technologies.
I think it really does depend on the issue. We all agree there's an enormous climate crisis that we have to solve. And yes, some of China's production can really put a dent in that crisis. But 2 or 3 points. First, we got to understand that some of the energy being used to produce those goods in China is far from clean, right? China still has an incredibly high mix of coal in its energy supply, and that's going to be the case in the period ahead. Second, China continues to build coal-fired plants around the world, perhaps even more significant than some of its investments in solar panels around the world. But put all that aside for a second. Let's take on very narrowly the question. If they can build all this stuff at scale and give it away to the world and basically take a loss, isn't that good? It is, unless you understand that this also forces disinvestment in other countries, right? That solving climate change or advancing the frontiers of energy is going to require some domestic support in all these countries around the world. They've got to have a stake in it. They've got to be able to benefit from that economy too. They've got to be able to make cars, for example. We can't all just buy Chinese cars. That's a strategic industry for every country. It always has been. So we have to ask ourselves, solar panels, all right, maybe it's not the end of the world if China makes the world's solar panels, but electric vehicles, batteries, that's a slightly different story. There, or nuclear, God forbid, we have to make sure that we also retain the capability to produce, to innovate, to scale, to find the next frontier of that technology. So I think it depends. I'm not sure that any question is purely categorical when it comes to a country as big as China and its role in the supply chain. And this is one of those complicated questions.
And look, I gotta say, regardless of whether we think that China is being a good actor, a bad actor, or just a self-interestedly neutral actor, it's clearly in everyone's interest, maybe not China's, but everyone else's interest for the United States to step up on these clean technology industries.
Yeah, this is the future, and we have to be a part of it. If we don't invest in these technologies, we're going to get left behind. And all these technologies, they're parts of a broader industrial ecosystem. Batteries are about a lot more than electric vehicles. If we don't have that technology, we can't do the stuff that comes downstream. We've got to be able to think long term.
Man, I'm so excited. If we can get China specialists like yourself, climate and energy nerds like me, to agree on the same stuff and come at policymakers from different directions, build this bipartisan consensus behind American competitiveness and emerging technologies, the sky's the limit.
Well, we'll start it here at CFR.
Start here at CFR.